Sometimes the smallest mistake opens a door that destiny has been waiting to unlock for years. Daniel Carter had repaired heating and cooling systems across Illinois for nearly 2 decades. And in all that time, he had learned one simple truth. Broken machines were easier to understand than broken people. Machines always left clues. People carried their pain in silence. That Tuesday morning began like hundreds before it. He kissed his 12-year-old daughter Sophie on the forehead before she boarded the school bus, climbed into his aging white service truck, and drove through downtown Chicago toward Harrison Grand Hotel, one of the most prestigious luxury hotels in America. His company had received an emergency maintenance request involving an air handling unit on the executive floor. Daniel had no interest in expensive hotels or famous guests. To him, every building looked the same once the ceiling panels came down and the mechanical rooms opened. He checked in with hotel engineering, signed a service log, lifted his heavy metal toolbox, and followed the directions printed on the temporary work order. The hallway became quieter with every step as polished marble floors replaced thick carpets and elegant artwork covered the walls. A hotel employee pointed toward the final suite at the end of the corridor before rushing away to answer another call. Daniel glanced once more at the paperwork, confirmed the room number, knocked twice, waited several seconds, then slowly turned the handle after hearing no reply. The suite door opened without resistance. Warm morning sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished wood floors, and every piece of furniture looked as though it belonged inside a museum rather than a hotel. Daniel immediately realized he had entered somewhere far beyond an ordinary guest room. Before he could quietly back away, a calm female voice interrupted the silence. "You are finally here." Daniel looked toward the center of the room and saw a graceful woman rising from behind a large executive desk. She wore an elegant navy business suit, and her composed expression carried neither surprise nor anger. Instead, she looked at him as though she had recognized an old friend after years of searching. Daniel quickly lowered his toolbox. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. I believe I opened the wrong room." The woman slowly smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. "No, Mr. Carter," she answered gently. "You opened exactly the right one." Daniel blinked in confusion. He had never met her before, yet she knew his name. Before he could ask another question, the suite door opened behind him, and an executive assistant stepped inside, carrying a tablet filled with meeting schedules. She stopped immediately after noticing the maintenance technician standing in the presidential suite. "Miss Harrison," she said carefully, "the board of directors is waiting downstairs." Claire Harrison never looked away from Daniel. "Tell them the meeting will begin later." The assistant hesitated, clearly shocked. "They have already assembled." Claire nodded calmly. "Then they can continue waiting." The assistant quietly left, closing the door behind her. Silence settled across the magnificent suite once again. Daniel shifted uneasily, unsure whether he should apologize again or simply leave before creating more confusion. Claire took one slow step forward, her voice almost a whisper now. "For 13 years, I searched for the man who stopped beside a lonely highway when everyone else kept driving." Daniel stared at her without speaking, his memory reaching toward a forgotten rainy night buried beneath years of ordinary work and quiet responsibilities. Claire's eyes filled with gratitude that had survived more than a decade. "I have been waiting for you." Daniel Carter remained motionless, his fingers still wrapped around the handle of his metal toolbox as he searched the woman's face for even the smallest sign that she had mistaken him for someone else. Nothing about her expression suggested uncertainty. Claire Harrison looked at him with the quiet relief of someone who had finally reached the end of a journey that had taken far longer than expected. Daniel cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, I think you may have confused me with another technician." Claire slowly shook her head. "There is no confusion." She walked toward a polished walnut cabinet built into the wall beside the fireplace and entered a security code on a hidden panel. Soft lights illuminated the interior as the glass door quietly opened. Resting inside the cabinet was an old brown work jacket carefully displayed on a custom wooden stand. Time had faded the fabric, and one sleeve still carried a small grease stain that no professional cleaning had ever removed. Daniel stared at the jacket without speaking. His breathing slowed. He knew that jacket. He had worn it for years before finally replacing it after the zipper failed. Claire carefully lifted it from the display with both hands, treating it with the same respect someone might show a treasured family photograph. "Do you recognize it?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded almost automatically. "I gave that away a long time ago." Claire smiled through eyes that had quietly filled with emotion. "You gave it to a frightened young woman standing beside a broken car on Interstate 55. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment as the memory slowly returned. Rain had been falling so heavily that evening it had blurred the highway lights into long golden streaks. He had been driving home after finishing a late repair when he noticed a sedan sitting on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. Most vehicles continued past without slowing. Daniel had pulled over because he believed nobody should face trouble alone on a stormy night. Claire continued the story before he could answer. "My father had passed away only a few hours earlier. I could barely think clearly enough to drive. Then my battery cable failed, and I believed everything was falling apart." Daniel remembered lifting the hood, tightening the damaged cable with the small wrench from his toolbox, and noticing that the young woman was trembling from both grief and the cold rain. Without thinking, he had taken off his work jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Claire gently touched the worn collar. "When I offered to pay you, you refused." Daniel smiled faintly. "You needed the money less than you needed someone to stop." Claire looked directly into his eyes. "You also said something that stayed with me every single day afterward." Daniel searched his memory, but could not immediately remember his own words. Claire quietly repeated them exactly as she had carried them in her heart for 13 years. "Do not let one terrible night decide the rest of your life." Silence settled across the magnificent suite. Daniel lowered his eyes with quiet embarrassment. "I did not know anyone would remember something like that." Claire carefully folded the jacket across her arms. "I remembered because it was the first kind thing anyone said to me after losing my father." Daniel looked around the luxurious suite before speaking with complete sincerity. "I never asked your name." Claire nodded gently. "And that is why it took me 13 years to find you." She looked once more at the weather jacket before returning her grateful gaze to the ordinary working father standing before her. "The jacket brought me through the hardest season of my life. Today it finally brought its owner back to me." Daniel Carter continued looking at the faded brown jacket, struggling to understand how one ordinary evening had remained alive inside another person's memory for so many years. To him, that rainy night had been only one small stop between work and home. He had repaired the damaged battery cable, offered his jacket to someone who looked cold and frightened, and driven away believing he would never see her again. Claire Harrison carefully returned the jacket to its glass display before closing the cabinet with quiet reverence. She turned toward Daniel with a grateful smile that carried years of unfinished emotion. "You probably believe that was just another service call on the side of the road," she said softly. Daniel answered with complete honesty. "I have helped people whenever I could. I never expected anyone to remember." Claire nodded gently. "That is exactly why I never forgot." She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline before continuing. "I spent years trying to find you. I hired private investigators. I searched old highway reports. I contacted repair companies across Illinois. I even returned to the same stretch of Interstate 55 every year, hoping someone might remember the man wearing the brown jacket." Daniel smiled with quiet disbelief. "You searched for 13 years using nothing more than an old jacket?" Claire laughed softly. "An old jacket, a first name that I overheard on your work radio, and one sentence that changed my life." Daniel lowered his eyes with humble embarrassment. "I wish I had remembered your name, too." Claire slowly shook her head. "You never asked for it because helping me was never about recognition." She walked back to her desk and opened a leather folder resting neatly beside several business reports. From inside, she removed a carefully preserved document protected by a transparent sleeve. 6 months ago, she said, everything changed. Daniel accepted the document and immediately noticed the title at the top of the page. The strongest person I know. Beneath the title appeared the author's name, Sophie Carter. His expression softened instantly. My daughter wrote this for a statewide student competition, he whispered. Claire nodded with a warm smile. The Harrison Foundation sponsored that competition. Thousands of essays arrived from schools across Illinois. I personally read the finalists because education has always been close to my heart. Then I opened Sophie's essay. Daniel quietly began reading familiar words describing a father who repaired broken furnaces, volunteered at the local library, never missed movie night, and believed kindness mattered most when nobody noticed. Claire watched him with quiet admiration. Halfway through the essay, she described the rainy night when you came home wearing someone else's gratitude instead of your own jacket. She repeated the exact sentence you told me 13 years earlier. At that moment, I knew the man I'd searched for was still living exactly the same way. Daniel smiled proudly before gently folding the pages closed. She remembers everything. Claire answered softly. She gave me the one thing I had never found. Your full name. Before Daniel could respond, his phone vibrated inside his pocket. He glanced at the screen and immediately smiled. It is Sophie. Claire motioned kindly for him to answer. Hello, sweetheart, Daniel said warmly. Sophie's cheerful voice filled the quiet room. Dad, you're still coming home for a mystery movie tonight, right? You promised. Daniel looked toward Claire with an apologetic smile before replying without hesitation. I would not miss it for anything. I will be home before dinner. After the call ended, Claire quietly realized that despite the luxury surrounding her and the influence she carried throughout the business world, the most important commitment in Daniel Carter's life was still a simple promise made to his daughter, and somehow that truth impressed her more than every success she had ever achieved. Daniel Carter slipped his phone back into his pocket with a quiet satisfaction that came from keeping a promise. For a long moment, neither he nor Claire Harrison spoke. The silence no longer felt awkward. It carried the peaceful weight of two lives finally crossing again after 13 years apart. Claire slowly walked toward her desk, picked up an elegant business card, and offered it to him with both hands. I know you have responsibilities waiting at home, she said gently. I only hope today is not the last time we speak. Daniel accepted the card respectfully before placing it inside the front pocket of his worn work shirt. Thank you, he replied with sincere appreciation. I still have an air handling unit that needs to be repaired, and my daughter is expecting me. After night, I would be happy to meet again. Claire smiled warmly. Your daughter is fortunate to have a father who never forgets his promises. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. After my wife passed away, I promised myself that Sophie would never have to wonder whether I would come home. Some promises become part of who you are. Claire quietly absorbed every word. She had spent years surrounded by powerful investors, celebrated entrepreneurs, and executives who measured success by profits and expansion plans. Yet the ordinary man standing before her measured success by whether a little girl trusted her father to return home every evening. Daniel lifted his heavy toolbox from the polished floor and gave one final respectful nod. It was good meeting you again, Miss Harrison. Claire answered with gentle gratitude. It was good finally finding you, Mr. Carter. Daniel turned and opened the suite door. At that exact moment, a young housekeeping supervisor pushing a service cart rounded the corner and froze in surprise. She immediately recognized the maintenance technician stepping out of the private presidential suite occupied by the company's chief executive officer. Daniel offered a polite smile, quietly stepped aside to let her pass, and continued walking toward the service elevator without realizing that a single ordinary moment had just become the beginning of an extraordinary misunderstanding. The housekeeping supervisor remained motionless for several seconds before another employee approached from the opposite hallway. Is everything all right? The second employee asked quietly. The supervisor glanced toward the closing elevator doors before answering in a whisper. I just saw the maintenance technician leave Miss Harrison's private suite. The conversation traveled no farther than two people at first, but by lunchtime, it had quietly passed from housekeeping to facilities, then from facilities to guest services, and finally into several executive offices. Every retelling added another assumption. Some believed the technician had discovered confidential information. Others insisted the chief executive officer had personally selected a new consultant. A few imagined a private business arrangement that did not exist. Nobody knew the truth because nobody had asked the only two people who actually understood it. Upstairs, Claire finally entered the executive boardroom nearly 40 minutes later than scheduled. Around the polished conference table sat directors responsible for guiding one of America's largest luxury hospitality companies. Charles Reynolds, the senior independent board member, looked up from the financial reports with calm curiosity. "Everything all right, Claire?" he asked politely. Claire took her seat with complete composure. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Charles nodded, but his attention drifted toward the delayed maintenance work order displayed on his tablet. The assigned technician's name remained visible. Daniel Carter. He quietly looked back at Claire and noticed something unusual. For the first time since joining the board many years earlier, the confident chief executive officer seemed distracted, not by billion-dollar decisions, but by one humble maintenance technician whose greatest concern had been getting home in time to watch a movie with his daughter. The meeting ended hours later, but the quiet conversation that truly mattered never appeared in the official minutes. As board members gathered their folders and left the conference room in small groups, whispers followed them into the hallways with surprising speed. Someone had noticed the maintenance technician entering the executive floor. Someone else had seen him leaving the private presidential suite. Another employee claimed that the chief executive officer had delayed the board meeting because of him. By late afternoon, assumptions had quietly become stories, and stories had begun sounding like facts. Daniel Carter knew nothing about any of it. He finished repairing the damaged air handling unit, completed the required safety inspection, signed the maintenance report, thanked the hotel engineering staff for their cooperation, and drove home through the familiar evening traffic. The moment he opened the front door, Sophie greeted him with a bright smile that always made the longest workday feel shorter. "You made it before dinner," she said happily. Daniel laughed softly. "I told you I would." Together, they prepared grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup before settling onto the old couch for their weekly mystery movie. Sophie talked excitedly about school, a science project, and the librarian who had recommended a new novel, while Daniel listened with the complete attention that only a devoted parent could give. Across the city, Claire Harrison sat alone inside her office long after the lights in neighboring buildings had faded. She found herself reading Sophie's essay once again instead of reviewing quarterly financial reports. Every paragraph reminded her that the man she had finally found had never changed. Success had not made him kinder because kindness had already been his way of living. The following morning, Daniel arrived at his company's warehouse expecting another ordinary schedule. Instead, his supervisor, Mike Sullivan, greeted him with an uneasy expression. "Daniel, can we talk for a minute?" Daniel quietly followed him into the office. Mike closed the door before speaking. "I received 2 phone calls this morning asking about you." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "About yesterday's hotel job?" Mike nodded slowly. "People are asking why you spent nearly an hour inside the chief executive officer's private suite. I told them I did not know because it was none of my business." Daniel lowered his eyes with quiet concern. "It was a misunderstanding. I opened the wrong door, and we ended up talking about something that happened years ago." Mike studied his employee for a moment before smiling. "I have known you for 11 years. If you say it was innocent, that is good enough for me." Daniel appreciated the trust, but he also understood how quickly harmless moments could become unnecessary distractions. Later that afternoon, he sat alone during his lunch break and carefully wrote a short letter addressed to Harrison Grand Hotels. In calm, respectful words, he thanked the company for the opportunity to provide maintenance services and requested that future assignments at any Harrison property be given to another technician. He explained that he wished to avoid creating additional speculation or inconvenience for anyone involved. There was no complaint, no bitterness, and no attempt to defend himself. He simply chose peace over attention. When Claire received the letter before the end of the business day, she read every sentence twice. The final line remained in her thoughts long after she placed the paper back on her desk. Some doors are better closed if opening them causes trouble for other people. Claire slowly folded the letter, realizing with quiet sadness that after searching 13 years to find Daniel Carter, she now risked losing him again because the world had mistaken humility for something it could never understand. Claire Harrison placed Daniel Carter's letter inside the same leather folder that already held Sophie's award-winning essay, then quietly canceled the remaining appointments on her afternoon schedule. She realized that reading reports about Daniel would never tell her who he truly was. If she wanted to understand the man who had walked away rather than allow misunderstanding to grow, she would have to see his life with her own eyes. Early the next morning, dressed in simple jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes instead of tailored executive clothing, Claire drove across town in an ordinary rental sedan with no company driver and no security detail. She began at the small public library mentioned several times in Sophie's essay. The building was modest, filled with warm sunlight, worn wooden shelves, and the quiet sounds of children discovering books. Claire introduced herself only as Claire and volunteered to help organize donated novels for the afternoon reading program. The librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, welcomed the extra pair of hands with grateful appreciation. As they sorted books together, Claire casually asked whether she knew a local father named Daniel Carter. Mrs. Brooks smiled immediately. "Of course I do. Every Thursday evening, he fixes whatever breaks around here before anyone even asks. Last winter, he repaired our heating system after closing time because he did not want the children arriving to a cold building the next morning. When I tried to pay him, he asked me to spend the money on new books instead." Claire quietly placed another novel onto the shelf while absorbing every word. Later that afternoon, she visited the neighborhood community center, where an elderly volunteer named Harold Jenkins laughed warmly when Daniel's name came up. He rebuilt our food pantry shelves after a summer storm damaged the storage room. He worked the entire Saturday with his daughter, handing him tools. Nobody from the neighborhood knew who completed the repairs until we found a handwritten note thanking us for helping local families. Claire continued her quiet journey over the next several days without revealing her identity. A widow spoke about Daniel replacing her broken furnace before the first snowfall and refusing payment because her late husband had once served as a volunteer firefighter. A young teacher described how Daniel repaired classroom air conditioners every August so students could begin the school year comfortably. A grocery store cashier remembered watching him quietly buy extra food whenever an elderly customer came up a few dollars short. None of these stories appeared on social media. None had been announced in newspapers. They lived only in grateful memories shared by ordinary people whose lives had become a little easier because one humble father believed kindness did not need an audience. On Friday evening, Claire returned to the library to return a stack of books she had borrowed during the week. From across the reading room, she noticed Daniel sitting beside Sophie at a small wooden table. Father and daughter laughed together while assembling a simple model of the solar system for her science project. Daniel patiently painted tiny planets with careful attention, celebrating every small success as though it were the greatest achievement in the world. Sophie suddenly looked up and waved cheerfully after recognizing Claire from the hotel. Daniel turned, pleasantly surprised, and stood to greet her with the same quiet courtesy he showed everyone else. "Good evening, Miss Harrison," he said warmly. "Welcome to our favorite place." Claire looked around the peaceful library before smiling with genuine admiration. "I think I finally understand why your daughter wrote that the strongest person she knows is not the one with the biggest office, but the one who always comes home with enough kindness left to share." Daniel lowered his eyes with gentle humility, completely unaware that while he had spent years repairing broken machines, his quiet example had slowly begun repairing a heart that success alone had never been able to heal. Claire Harrison drove away from the library that evening with a quiet peace she had not experienced in years, Yet Daniel Carter's handwritten letter remained folded inside her purse like an unfinished conversation. She understood, now that he had not withdrawn from Harrison Grand Hotels because he felt rejected. He had stepped away because he believed protecting another person's reputation mattered more than protecting his own. That realization stayed with her throughout the weekend. On Monday morning, she arrived at headquarters earlier than usual, but instead of walking directly into the executive offices, she stopped in the employee cafe where staff members from every department gathered before beginning their shifts. Rather than sitting at the reserved executive table, she carried her own coffee to an empty seat beside two housekeeping employees who looked surprised by the unexpected company. They spoke about their families, rising grocery prices, school schedules, and the challenges of balancing work with everyday life. Claire listened more than she talked. For the first time in many years, nobody around her cared about quarterly earnings or hotel expansion plans. They simply appreciated being heard. Throughout the following weeks, small changes quietly appeared across the company. Claire began visiting hotels without advance notice, not to inspect performance reports, but to thank engineers, front desk associates, housekeepers, cooks, and maintenance crews for work that often went unnoticed. She introduced a monthly recognition program celebrating acts of kindness instead of sales numbers alone. Employees who helped coworkers or guests without expecting recognition received handwritten letters from the chief executive officer herself. Many wondered what had inspired such an unexpected change, but Claire never mentioned Daniel's name. She believed true gratitude should spread through actions rather than speeches. Meanwhile, Daniel continued living exactly as he always had. Every Thursday evening, he repaired small problems at the library. Every Friday, he watched movies with Sophie, and every Saturday he volunteered wherever an extra pair of hands was needed. He never called Claire, never asked whether she had received his letter, and never imagined that his quiet example had already begun changing one of the country's most respected hospitality companies from the inside. One afternoon, Claire visited the library again, carrying a box of newly donated children's books. Sophie recognized her immediately and hurried over with a welcoming smile. "You came back," she said happily. Claire nodded. "I promised Mrs. Brooks I would help with today's reading program." Sophie grinned. "Dad says people who keep coming back are the ones who really care." Claire glanced toward Daniel, who was replacing a flickering light fixture near the entrance with calm concentration. He climbed down from the ladder, returned his tools to the small box beside him, and greeted her with the same sincere warmth he offered everyone. "Good afternoon, Miss Harrison. It is nice to see you again." Claire smiled. "Please call me Claire when we are here." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Then you must call me Daniel." They spent the afternoon arranging books, reading stories to children, and serving cookies donated by a neighborhood bakery. There were no photographers, no reporters, and no business announcements. Only laughter, quiet conversations, and grateful smiles filled the little library. As the last family left before sunset, Claire noticed Daniel discreetly picking up several pieces of paper a child had accidentally dropped onto the floor. He folded each drawing carefully instead of throwing it away and placed them on the librarian's desk so the young artist could reclaim them later. It was another tiny act that no one else noticed. Claire realized that Daniel's character was not revealed through extraordinary moments. It lived inside hundreds of ordinary choices made every single day. Standing in the golden evening light shining through the library windows, she silently understood that the greatest leaders were not always the ones standing in front of a boardroom. Sometimes they were the ones quietly kneeling to pick up someone else's forgotten pages before anyone even realized they had fallen. Nearly a month had passed since Daniel Carter quietly stepped away from future assignments at Harrison Grand Hotels, yet his absence seemed to leave a greater impression than his presence ever had. Claire Harrison had watched her company begin to change in small but meaningful ways. But one unfinished responsibility still remained. Rumors had never been corrected. Assumptions had never been replaced with truth. She refused to allow an honorable man's name to remain surrounded by uncertainty simply because he had been too humble to defend himself. At the next quarterly board meeting, Every director gathered around the long walnut conference table, expecting discussions about financial forecasts, new hotel acquisitions, and investment strategies. Instead, Claire entered carrying a small leather folder and the carefully preserved brown work jacket folded across her arms. Several board members exchanged puzzled glances. Charles Reynolds spoke first. "Claire, is everything all right?" She placed the jacket gently at the center of the table before answering. "Today I want to discuss the most valuable investment this company has ever received." The room became completely still. Claire slowly opened the folder and removed Sophie's essay, Daniel's handwritten letter, and a faded photograph taken years earlier by a highway assistance volunteer, showing a young woman wrapped in a weathered brown work jacket beside a disabled sedan during a heavy rainstorm. She began telling the story from the beginning. She described losing her father, breaking down along Interstate 55, and believing she had reached the darkest moment of her life. She explained how an unknown maintenance technician had stopped without expecting recognition, repaired her car, wrapped his only jacket around her shoulders, refused payment, and left after speaking one sentence that carried her through years of grief. Then she described spending 13 years searching for the man she never properly thanked until a school essay written by his daughter finally revealed his identity. No one interrupted. Claire continued by reading Daniel's letter aloud. Every sentence reflected respect, humility, and concern for other people rather than himself. He had willingly stepped away from future work simply to prevent unnecessary speculation from affecting the company. When she finished reading, silence settled across the boardroom with remarkable weight. Charles Reynolds slowly removed his glasses and looked at the folded jacket resting on the polished table. "So the rumors were completely false," he said quietly. Claire nodded. "The only relationship between Daniel Carter and me is gratitude that has waited 13 years to be expressed." Another director lowered her eyes before speaking. "We judged a man we had never met." Claire answered gently. "He never asked for recognition. He only asked to avoid causing trouble for others." Charles remained silent for several moments before turning toward the company's general counsel. "Please prepare a formal resolution." Every face around the table lifted with quiet attention. Charles continued in a calm voice. "Effective immediately, Harrison Grand Hotels recognizes Daniel Carter for his extraordinary integrity, compassion, and example of selfless character. His withdrawal letter will not be accepted. Instead, he and his family will always be welcomed as honored guests at any Harrison property if they ever choose to visit." No applause followed. None was necessary. The room was filled instead with something far more meaningful. It was the silence that arrives when pride quietly steps aside and respect finally takes its place. Claire looked once more at the old brown jacket before carefully folding it into her arms. She understood that awards, titles, and wealth could inspire admiration, but only quiet dignity could earn lasting respect. At that moment, every person seated around the table recognized the same simple truth. The humblest man they had never bothered to notice had become the greatest teacher their company had ever known. 1 year later, the little neighborhood library looked exactly as Daniel Carter remembered it, filled with quiet conversations, the gentle turning of pages, and sunlight stretching across old wooden floors that had welcomed generations of curious readers. Some places measure their value by appearance. This place measured its worth by the lives it quietly shaped every day. Daniel arrived carrying a small toolbox after receiving a call from Mrs. Eleanor Brooks about a loose ceiling fan in the children's reading room. Sophie, now a year older and noticeably taller, followed. Beside him, carrying a canvas bag filled with books she planned to return. They greeted familiar volunteers like family because, over time, that was exactly what the library had become. Daniel repaired the fan with the same patient care he gave every task, tightened the final screw, cleaned the work area, and quietly packed away his tools before anyone thought to thank him. As he stepped back into the main reading room, he noticed Claire Harrison standing near the front window, dressed simply as she had been during every visit over the past year. There were no assistants waiting behind her, no photographers, and no signs that she led one of the largest hotel companies in America. She held something carefully wrapped inside a linen cloth. Daniel smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Claire." She returned the smile with peaceful gratitude. "I've been looking forward to today." Sophie excused herself to help Mrs. Brooks organize donated books, leaving the two adults standing quietly beside the shelves where their unusual friendship had slowly grown through ordinary afternoons rather than extraordinary events. Claire gently unfolded the linen cloth and revealed the old brown work jacket, now professionally restored without removing the faded marks that told its story. She held it out with both hands. "It has stayed with me long enough," she said softly. "It belongs home now." Daniel accepted the jacket with visible surprise, running his fingers across the familiar fabric before quietly laughing. "I never imagined I would wear this again." Claire smiled. "Neither did I, but I wanted you to have it back exactly when it felt right." Daniel slipped the jacket over his shoulders. Although it was old, it still fit comfortably, as though the years between then and now had simply been another chapter waiting to close. Sophie looked up from across the room, saw her father wearing the jacket, and smiled with immediate recognition. "That is the one from my essay," she said happily. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. It finally found its way home." Mrs. Brooks gathered the children for the afternoon story hour, and Sophie hurried over to join them. Claire watched the room fill with laughter, whispered conversations, and families enjoying simple moments together. "The board approved a new foundation program last month," she said quietly. "Every Harrison hotel will sponsor community libraries in the cities where we operate. The first grants have already been delivered." Daniel looked at her with sincere appreciation. "That will help a lot of children." Claire gently shook her head. "It started because one father believed buying books was more important than paying him for fixing a heater." Daniel smiled with the same quiet humility that had never changed. "Kindness has a way of traveling farther than we expect." As the afternoon sunlight settled across the library windows, no one applauded, no speeches were given, and no headlines were written. A father returned to his daughter. A grateful woman returned a borrowed jacket, and a simple act of compassion completed a journey that had begun beside a rainy highway 13 years earlier. Some people spend their lives searching for greatness in extraordinary achievements, yet the truest miracles often begin with ordinary choices made in silence, protected by dignity, strengthened by grace, and remembered long after the world finally learns the quiet power of a good heart.